You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Financial Times associate editor and columnist Stephen Bush and political commentator Benedict Spence. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Guardian claims an exclusive with the president of the TUC telling the paper that defecting MP Natalie Elphicke is incompatible with membership of the Labour Party. The Mail previews a speech by PM Rishi Sunak saying the country is entering a dangerous and challenging era and Labour would leave us vulnerable to it. The Telegraph also leads on that speech. The Metro leads with leaked documents revealing that medical experts likened haemophiliac patients to laboratory chimps before injecting them with infected blood plasma that killed or ruined the lives of hundreds of people in the 1970s and 80s. The Times leads with a study saying that obese people are up to twice as likely to take time off work, as the paper puts it, fuelling the UK sick note culture. The Mirror has been investigating the tax affairs of 4 Tory MPs in response to criticism of Labour's Angela Rayner over the sale of her council house. The Eye reports on the prospect of 40-year mortgages, which could leave the new generation of home buyers still paying for their house into retirement. The FT reports on a major government bond sale being mounted by the Chinese authorities in order to boost the country's economy. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Financial Times associate editor and columnist Stephen Bush and political commentator Benedict Spence. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the front page of The Telegraph. The headline there, PM Britain safe under Tories for dangerous years ahead. And the other assumption that's made is that it wouldn't be under a Labour government. Stephen, take us into this piece.
All right, so Rishi Sunak is, I was about to say, kicking off what's probably going to be a very, very long election campaign, essentially tomorrow, by setting out the ways that the world is getting more dangerous, more unpredictable, the geopolitical conflict that we've all just seen just there, developments like AI, rising immigration. Now, the politics of this are one major advantage the Labour Party has, is that since the fall of Boris Johnson, the Conservatives have delivered or overseen through no fault of their own, depending on your perspective, one form of chaos after another. And the thing that, broadly speaking, happened with the Liz Truss premiership is voters shifted from going, it's a difficult set of circumstances and it's not wholly the government's fault, to going, actually, it's the government's fault. And so the thing that he's trying to do politically in this speech is sort of once again get back to that position where people go, OK, actually, it is a difficult global picture in general, rather than going, it's the fault of the Conservatives, they are the cause of all of this chaos and uncertainty. And this is actually, I think, going to be the big battleground of this election. The Labour Party's message will be, 14 years, are you better off? Don't forget the Liz Truss experiment. And Rishi Sunak's message will be like, don't forget that we did all of this stuff during the pandemic, I've steadied the ship, I have the plan to lead us through this chaos.
Yes, and so he's going to be setting out his vision for the next 5 years and saying that every aspect of people's lives will alter with more change as we see happening.
Yeah, there is a slight gamble, though, to all of this, which is, aside from the simple fact that people might not listen to it and they might look at it and go, well, that's a record, and we do actually decide that we trust Sir Keir Starmer more than we do you. And that is effectively, you're sort of laying out your stall and saying, well, going back to what Stephen was saying, that actually a lot of these were sort of circumstances beyond our control. What does that say about a government that, pledges to lead a first world leading power, to say, well, all of these things happened and what on earth could we have possibly done about them? Oh, whoops, that's not great.
And for all of this length of time as well.
Exactly. It's all very well pointing to different wars and different sort of global events and saying, well, we couldn't possibly have foreseen that. But perhaps justifiably people would say, well, hang on a second, you're the British government. This is supposed to be the sort of thing that you are on top of, the sort of power that wants to be able to deploy forces overseas or interfere in the politics of other countries. This is the sort of thing that we should perhaps be a little bit more prepared for. How is it that X, Y, Z, many number of things did happen on your watch? And again, actually very few of these things have happened on the watch of Rishi Sunak. It was what came before. But nonetheless, that's the argument, isn't it? It's been 14 years. One thing after another has happened. And whether or not you sit there and you go, oh, yes, well, we can completely take the rap for this, or these were entirely things beyond our control, people are still going to look at it and go, well, it did happen on your watch. I suppose the fear might be from the Labour Party that Sir Keir Starmer didn't expect to be in this position, actually. I think he still thought, well, when he took over, rather, I think he thought he had probably 2 election cycles to detoxify the Labour Party from what it had been before, and that there might still be that sort of sense of mistrust from some members of the public to think, might Labour decide to sort of slide back in one direction? Might it decide to endorse the Europhile wing a little bit too much? For instance, in certain Red Wall seats, they might go, well, that's not exactly what we want, we're maybe a little bit too fearful. But I simply think that the general sense of malaise from the Conservative brand is too overpowering for that to be too much of a worry right now.
Stephen, what about this line that the Prime Minister will be echoing the warnings that we've heard from Lord Cameron of this need for the UK to adopt a harder edge for a tougher world, you know, bearing in mind where we see ourselves with Russia, with Israel and Gaza, etc.?
Well, I think on the one hand, look, it is unquestionably true that we are in an era of pronounced geopolitical uncertainty, and the UK faces a very challenging backdrop, as all democracies currently do. On the other, although David Cameron's tenure Foreign Secretary has been great for UK PLC in that he's a figure who is recognised internationally, he's increased the UK's ability to cut through at the highest levels, for many, many voters, including the people the Conservative Party very badly needs to win back, the descent into chaos begins with David Cameron's mishandling of the referendum in 2016, his resignation the morning after. So in some ways, the problem is that it's a message which has a lot in it, but when it's tied to the first Prime Minister out of 5 and the 5th out of 5, it becomes exactly as Benedict was just saying, right? It's well, isn't this an issue that the government should be on top of? You know, aren't we a mid-sized power which ought to be able to manage this stuff?
There's a similarity there to the fate of Tony Blair, who sort of spent much of his sort of post-prime ministerial career sort of trying to sound the alarm on all sorts of things, trying to influence policy, and people simply aren't interested in what he has to sell, no matter how sort of sensible it might sound, how well researched, because he's perpetually going to be tied to Iraq and maybe to lesser degree the financial crisis in 2008. So it's a similar sort of situation there. You've got these 2, it must be said, still, even now, former Prime Ministers who command great respect within the party, great influence, but actually are almost completely toxic to the electorate. And that is kind of what, is sort of relying on. This is one of the things that actually people have tried to paint Sir Keir Starmer, which is that he's, sort of back to Blairism, but Blairism light. It's not really stuck, but you can see why people are doing that, because actually you tarnish people with that brush and actually they become a little bit too toxic.
Stephen, take us into this next story, the front of the eye, and this is the rise in 40-year mortgages as millions face repayments into retirement.
Yeah, right. So essentially, as everyone will know, property prices have risen an awful amount. The amount that you have to therefore both have but also to borrow has increased. And one market solution to this has been the rise of very long mortgages, 35, 40-year mortgages. Now, in a way, that's great because it gets people on the housing ladder. But if you are 30 and you have a 40-year mortgage, well, do the maths. Are you going to be working and being able to service the last of that mortgage age 70? Now, the hope and the calculated gamble that both borrowers and banks are taking is that as those people progress up their working life, they will be able to overpay and they will pay it off early. But there is a real risk for the United Kingdom, right? Then we're going to head to this period where you have a large group of pensioners who do not own an asset, and effectively our whole model of caring for the elderly is based on the idea that the average retired person has a house that they can then either sell or borrow against to fund their care in their final years. So this is, this is great news in some ways for getting people on the property ladder and giving them that stake in the future, but it is potentially a big, big risk too.
Benedict, are there positives in the increase in 40-year mortgages?
Oh, I think so. I'm very lazy, and this is going to keep me very motivated in terms of keeping working in order, because otherwise I won't have a roof over my head. So I'm trying to look at the positives. There is the other side to this, which is that the boomer generation, if you like, is setting on quite a large pile of assets. That at some point it is going to relinquish by hook or by crook, and that will feed back down the system. The problem is, of course, given the increase in the value of those, a lot more of them are going to be caught up in things like inheritance tax, and you can just envisage actually governments down the line are going to look to try to fund things like social care by implementing more taxes on wealth. So perhaps a little bit less of that than people might hope for will end up dropping down. So maybe people will be able to pay a bit more of their way that way, but that's a hell of a gamble to say you're odds of being able to pay off or afford a house basically relies on A, your parents or grandparents having bought very favourably, and it having inflated enough so that even after the inheritance tax, you've still got quite a nice pot of cash with which to pay off your own mortgage. And for everybody else who doesn't have that, well, sorry, you're going to be working into your 70s and above. Doesn't sound like a great deal, does it?
Stephen, we've only got about a minute, but I just want to get this story in on the front of The Guardian regarding Labour welcoming Natalie Elphicke. We've got the union bosses now saying that she's totally incompatible with what Labour stands for. Is this a misstep by Sir Keir Starmer?
I think it potentially is a misstep. It's always a good one-day story to have an MP defecting from everybody because it sends a signal to people who themselves voted that way, then it's an acceptable journey to make, and then the party in question has changed. But I think because, as it stands, there are a lot of questions that people in the Labour Party have about whether or not this is a sincere conversion or one driven by opportunism, it could well reinforce doubts people have about Keir Starmer as someone who, you know, has been a bit devious, perhaps has said one thing and done another. So I think it really depends on how the Labour leadership handles this defection over the coming few days. Can they reassure people that she really has changed her views, or will it make the Labour Party look shady and shifty?
Benedict, very quickly.
I think that actually the idea of migration and illegal immigration is something that the Tories have tried to needle Labour a little bit with, suggest that they might be softer than the Tories currently are. I think to have somebody on the right of the Tory party in one of those constituencies that's most affected by this coming out and saying, actually, I trust Sir Keir Starmer more than I do Rishi Sunak, I think that'll play a lot better with the voters he needs to win over. And perhaps, you know, some people in the Labour Party might not like it, but actually they're not so important because, well, they're all going to vote Labour anyway, aren't they? This is about winning over people in crucial seats that perhaps they might not be so sure of.
OK, Benedict and Stephen, for the moment, thank you. We're going to take a break, but coming up, Russia is pushing into Kharkiv. We'll be discussing that when we come back. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Financial Times Associate Editor and columnist Stephen Bush and political commentator Benedict Spence. Let's start this section with a look at the Times and this story off the back of a study presented at the European Congress on obesity in Venice, suggesting that the UK sick note culture is fuelled by the obesity crisis. Stephen?
Yeah, well, so what the study shows is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, the heavier you are, the more likely you are to have to take time off sick, because of course we know that, you know, being above a healthy body weight leads to any number of sicknesses. Now, where the Times has put a slight topspin on this is linking this with the speech by speeches and statements by government ministers a couple of weeks ago saying we have a sick note culture in the UK. Now, it is far from clear that what drives our higher rates of obesity as a country are the culture of how we deal with benefits and sick notes, not least because we are one of the fattest countries in Europe. We also have the least generous benefits in Europe, pretty much. So it's not obvious that these two things are linked. But this is a really big problem for us as a country. Like, we have got to get healthier. Yeah, it's a big problem for people's mental health, physical health, pressures on the health service. So I think this is the kind of story which will make the government feel like they are at least talking about, not only talking about the big issues when they're talking about welfare reform, but they're also talking about it in a language that's hard for the Labour Party to ape. So, yeah, there's a lot going on with this story.
Do you think there is a spurious link between the sick note culture, as they say, and the obesity crisis?
Well, I don't think you can just put sick note culture down to one thing, is the thing. You have to sort of look at it in the round. And of course, the thing that's been doing the rounds for a very long time is discussions around the number of people who are off long-term sick to do with poor mental health. And I think it's not necessarily, you know, as Stephen says, there's sort of the tie-in, the idea between obesity and benefit culture and a sort of a lower socioeconomic background. I'm not entirely sure that that's the case anymore. Actually, increasingly, I think that when it comes to things like nutrition and poor nutrition and being overweight, that's as much something that affects the middle class as anything else. Partly because actually a lot of people are so time poor, especially those who are in work, actually, that they don't necessarily have the wherewithal or the resources to be able to cook a very nice wholesome meal every day. Also, often they are tired. They get home at the end of the day, and what is it they need? They need calories because they need energy because they're exhausted. So, you know, it's something that I don't think you can just sort of put down to one thing. But again, actually, I do actually believe that the bigger thing when it comes to the workforce is probably the mental health issue. I think when it comes to things like weight, that's a much more sort of a long-term thing when it comes to affecting people who are perhaps left the workforce or are leaving the workforce early, because, as Stephen says, it ends up affecting all kinds of things. The links between obesity to things like cancer or dementia, actually, they're there. They're very clear, but it affects you in the later stages of life, not when you're, part of the main bulk of the workforce.
Stephen, take us to the Financial Times, and the photo on the front page, really talking about the Russian push in the Kharkiv region, this reinforced push towards Kharkiv.
Yeah, although as we report, analysts say that this is more likely to be a feint designed to draw away Ukrainian forces rather than a renewed push on the city itself. But it really underlines that at the moment, Russia is winning this war. There are a variety of reasons for that, not least the prolonged period in which neither Europe nor the United States could get their act together on providing the necessary arms to Ukraine. And it's accompanied by this quite hard to pass from the outside, because obviously Russia is a hard country to report on these days, purging of parts of the general military staff, including one of his long-term allies and aides. So a lot is going on here, but the big picture story at the moment is what looks like sweeping successes for Vladimir Putin in his invasion of Ukraine.
We're going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time. Benedict, I know you were ready to
okay.
jump in. We'll be back in the next half hour. For the moment, thank you both.